Welcome, and thank you for joining RAPS and Synchrogenix, a Certara company, for today's presentation on narrative writing. Over the next 45 minutes, Synchrogenix's narrative experts, Beth Miller and Gabriella Mangino, will offer a new perspective on the future of patient narrative production, as well as provide guidance for adding efficiency in your narrative process through the use of streamlined safety data reporting and the implementation of technology. To begin our presentation, I will turn it over to Beth Miller, Safety Project Manager at Synchrogenix. Beth has been in the medical writing field for over 15 years and has managed and written narratives for over 40 projects. In her current role, Beth is responsible for all aspects of project management for narrative projects, including organizing and preparing narrative deliverables. Beth, kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica, for the kind introduction. It's an honor for me to be here this morning, so thank you so much for the opportunity. Today, I'm going to be talking about patient safety narratives, including best practices and transparency and disclosure. So what exactly is a patient safety narrative? Safety narratives are very important to clinical study reporting, and they should be prepared for all phases of clinical studies and across all therapeutic areas, whether studies are conducted in healthy volunteers or in patients with the disease being studied. Per ICH E3, a safety narrative should describe deaths, serious adverse events, non-serious adverse events leading to study discontinuation, and adverse events of special interest, which can vary depending on things like the indication, disease under study, and study type. And this is referred to as your criteria for writing. A narrative should include details about the patient, including age, sex, race, medical history, the history of the disease under study, past and current treatments, and baseline laboratory results. And it should also include a full and preferably chronological account of the events that meet the criteria and their progression during or immediately after a clinical study. So the narrative should read like a detailed story describing the clinical course leading to the event, the nature, intensity, and outcome of the event, information about the study drug, including the dose and duration of the study drug, timing of the event in relation to study drug administration, and any action taken with the study drug due to the event. And the narrative should also describe important laboratory results relevant to the event, treatment for the event, and the investigator and sponsor opinions regarding causality. So after reading a narrative, you should have a full understanding of what happened to the study participant and the details surrounding the event of interest. There's typically a lot of patient data and subsequently a lot to write about. The medical writer uses a variety of sources, including clinical database listings, patient profiles, COMS forms, MedWatch forms, case report forms. And the length of the narrative can vary from 1 to 4 or more pages, depending on the number of AEs and how much data are available. Next slide. So now that we know what safety narratives are, let's get into exactly what the role of the patient safety narrative is. Safety narratives help with the evaluation of the safety profile of drugs. And as mentioned on the previous slide, the medical writers use source information to draft the narratives with the assistance and review by stats and the clinical team. And then these narratives are typically included as an appendix to clinical study reports and are also required to support pharmacovigilance activities. And they are submitted to regulatory authorities as part of a dossier. Depending on the size of the clinical trial and the complexity, a clinical report may include only 1 or 2 narratives, or it may include a couple of thousand. So, as I mentioned, safety narratives provide a concise summary of specific adverse events and important relevant information, and this helps the researchers and other parties, including pharmacovigilance, regulatory affairs, the clinical team, the Data Safety Monitoring Board, and regulatory authorities, identify safety issues that may require further investigation. Further investigation may involve the need for further clinical trials or additional narratives being written specifically for certain events. And then all of this information helps researchers and regulatory authorities understand a potential causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event. Safety narratives also play an important role in meta-analysis as similar events are compared across studies to look for patterns and causality. Next slide. So who reviews patient safety narratives? Regulatory agencies. During their review, they look for the frequency, severity, and seriousness of events, things that might affect and predict the occurrence of adverse drug reactions, such as age, gender, ethnicity, race, renal or hepatic function, concomitant medications or disease, genetic characteristics, and dose of the study drug. They also look for events that might require future monitoring, whether the narrative information supports the safety analysis and drug-drug interaction, if applicable. And keep in mind that these documents that are submitted to regulatory authorities are required to meet regulatory guidelines in terms of structure, content, and format. The narratives are typically included within the text of section 12.3.2 of the clinical study report if the number of narratives is low, for example, less than 10, or in section 14.3.3 as an appendix if there are more than 10 narratives. They might also be submitted as part of a regulatory authority response document if additional narratives for specific events of interest were requested. And narratives are also sometimes submitted to data safety monitoring boards for review. All right, next slide. So I wanted to talk a bit about the process involved with drafting patient safety narratives, and specifically about how we did things in the past versus how we're doing things now and the direction we're heading in for the future. Generally, the process of writing narratives involves preparation of a template, which maps where each piece of information is pulled from in the data, preparation of sample narratives, and then once the samples are approved, preparation of a first draft narrative from patient data by the medical writer. And then this is followed by peer review by another medical writer, clinical and safety review by the sponsor, and then the narratives are revised as needed and go through quality control review, approval, and publishing as part of a clinical study report or other dossier. So I've been in the field of medical writing for over 15 years. And when I first started in medical writing, all narratives and all pieces of narratives were done manually. We had to search through thousands of pages of PDF listings and sometimes Microsoft Word listings by patient number, and then enter each piece of data manually into the narrative template, which was also created and mapped manually. This left a lot of room for error as we manually typed things into the narrative when looking between documents. And in addition, it took a very long time. For example, with this sample sentence shown here from a narrative, each of the highlighted pieces of information would have to be located and pulled manually from the listings. And it wasn't odd to spend 4 to 8 hours on each complex narrative and maybe only complete 1 or 2 narratives per day. Nowadays, we have programmed patient profiles and programmed portions of narratives, which saves us so much time. We don't have to comb through thousands of pages looking for just the patient we're writing about. Each of these highlighted data pieces are pulled programmatically into the narrative instead. So we're able to focus on what actually happened to the patient and what is relevant to the events. And of course, it makes the narrative more accurate as we're not manually pulling over data from one document to another. And because we're saving so much time by using these programmed options, we're less likely to have to draft narratives using pre-database locked data, which are often dirty. And this saves time overall as the narratives are drafted using final clean data and they don't have to be updated, so there's less chance for error. Back in the old days, when we completed the narratives manually with no programming help, we typically had a small header at the top where we manually entered the patient number, maybe the events triggering the narrative, and then the rest was in paragraph form. We'd have a long paragraph giving the patient's demographics and medical history, followed by a second long paragraph summarizing the concomitant medications, and then maybe more long paragraphs summarizing other background information, previous events, and the events of interest. It was cumbersome and it was not concise. Nowadays, the programming allows for us to start with a patient profile or programmed header table that has all of the medical history, con meds, baseline information, et cetera, already presented. Then the actual text portion is a clear and concise story of what happened. It's easier to read and sort through, and the shorter text is also much easier to QC. There's definitely more of a focus now on being concise and only including relevant information rather than just dumping everything into the text. And in the past, technology did not allow for an easy compare of previous data versus updated data when narratives were produced with different data cutoff dates. So we would have to compare the previously written narrative to the updated data by hand and make any updates to the text. And once again, this introduced a lot of human error. Nowadays, we have programs that compare two sets of data and produce an output that highlights changes between the two sets of data in different colors, depending on if it's new data, maybe a new adverse event, changed data, or deleted data. For example, if an event was removed. This makes it very easy to update narratives by only seeing what changed and not having to comb through and compare multiple sets of data by hand. Next slide. So following this vein of technology improving things nowadays and narratives presenting a full story of what happened to a patient in a clinical trial, I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about transparency and disclosure related to the patient safety narratives, and specifically redaction and anonymization. In the setting of clinical trials, the protection of patient confidentiality has to be balanced with transparency. There's been a big push in recent years for clinical trials to be more transparent, including the release of full clinical study reports to the public. It's believed that greater transparency boosts patient safety in many ways, including by promoting accountability, driving improvements in patient safety, promoting trust, and facilitating patient choice. And related to this, the ICH E3 guidance states that patient narratives should include all information that is important for understanding the event, such as age, race, gender, and medical history. Narratives are very important for transparency of reporting, but protecting patient confidentiality is a requirement that we cannot overlook. With greater transparency, it's even more important to protect personal data. The EMA and other regulatory agencies have been struggling with how to strike that balance between patient confidentiality and transparency. Loss of contextual information can significantly diminish the value of the data for research. In recent years, a majority of sponsors have been opting to redact narratives entirely from their marketing authorization applications. But as mentioned, narratives provide important information on the safety of an investigational drug, so ideally these would not be completely redacted. So now sponsors are exploring ways of anonymizing narratives rather than completely redacting them. EMA Policy 70 was first introduced in 2015 and provided for the proactive publication by the EMA of clinical data from clinical reports submitted to it. But as I mentioned, balancing privacy and transparency is a difficult task. How do you increase transparency while also not risking breaches of subject privacy? This policy also provides guidance for anonymization in clinical trials and states that case narratives should not be removed nor redacted in full, regardless of their location in clinical reports. They should be instead anonymized. Regardless of the anonymization used, the EMA cannot accept redaction of the entire case narrative by default as a rule. As far as anonymization versus redaction, Anonymization is better for data utility and reuse, while redaction is less valuable. But anonymization of patient narratives is something that's evolving, and technology is supporting it. Next slide. So the minimum requirement to make health and biological data anonymous is removing names, addresses, and other direct individual identifiers, along with other information that might indirectly enable a patient's identity to be determined. This is called the patient's protected personal information, or their personally identifiable information, and it can occur nearly anywhere in a narrative. This might include information regarding a patient's medical history, including treatments prescribed, outcomes, and perhaps adverse reactions, which could in principle be correlated with other sources of information to yield a patient's identity. Complete anonymization might remove all association between a trial participant and the clinical data generated in the trial, or anonymized data might just lack names, addresses, and identifiers. This can be dependent on study size and study enrollment as far as deciding what should be kept or what should be removed entirely. Regulatory authorities generally recommend a 9% re-identification risk threshold to be applied, and they recommend using a quantitative rather than a qualitative approach, as a quantitative approach to risk measurement is more precise, less subjective, and retains more data utility. Typically, the steps involve identifying and classifying the variables, measuring the risk of identification, which depends on study size, number of sites, therapeutic area, et cetera, and then anonymizing the data. In some cases, the ID number used might be a randomized code of 5 digits, or instead of using a patient's age, maybe use an age range. It also involves removing gender-specific information, and also removing information about specific family members or situations that may have appeared in the news, such as traffic accidents. So retrospective anonymization of narratives often involves going back after the narrative is written and redacting all personally identifiable information. This is typically done manually, and it can be quite time-consuming. Technology can be used to identify personally identifiable information and proactively anonymize it at an early stage to ensure that downstream uses of the data are secure. The benefits of this include consistency of anonymized outputs and better identification of personally identifiable information. And risk calculation helps determine what can be safely included in a narrative without compromising patient confidentiality. This is still evolving, with development of future technology focusing on risk assessment of subject identification and not removing clinically relevant information, and making sure that anonymized outputs are consistent. Next slide. Now I'd like to turn things over to Gabriella Mangino, who will talk about how technology has been evolving in regard to patient safety narratives. Gabriella has many years of patient narrative production and project management experience in the pharmaceutical industry. As a product manager at Synchrogenix, she works with the commercial and services group to help develop and improve the software that supports our technology-enabled authoring capabilities, including the programming of safety narratives. Gabriella, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Beth. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you all about my favorite part of the narrative production process, which is being able to use technology. And that seems to be the trend in the future now, is let's use tech as much as we can. So when I refer to technology, I'm referring to programming the narrative template for drafting efforts, just as you would when you were programming TLFs for a CSR, for example. So before I begin, I want to give you a little bit of food for thought. I want to go through some questions that I want you to think about what your responses to these questions would be. Think about some past projects you've supported, even your current narrative process. And if you don't say yes to any of these questions, I think you're lying. So do internal or external pressures leave your under-resourced teams feeling overwhelmed by an unachievable timeline to produce narratives? Does your team feel like it's always reliant on your programming group? Are you concerned with maintaining quality and consistency across your high volume submission of narratives? So I'm going to be presenting this tech portion of the presentation from the perspective of the sponsor-vendor relationship in narrative production. Although many pieces of the process are applicable if you are utilizing programming internally yourself. So our many years of project experience kind of laid out these common service scenarios that you'll see, and you'll see the difference between working with technology in your process and working without technology and how that can affect these scenarios. So I want you to think of the without technology way as the old school, fully manual way of writing narratives versus the newer with technology way of producing narratives with a program template output. So let's think of the first scenario, high volume. Without technology, you might need to onboard a very large production team. And this large production team can introduce errors and inconsistencies. Sure, your team's following a template and writing in the same style, but everyone writes a little bit uniquely. So you're introducing consistencies. When you're utilizing technology in your process, you're able to onboard a smaller, more efficient production team because of the internal efficiencies you gain while you're drafting. The next scenario is template development. This is a crucial piece in the process. When you develop your template up front, you want to make sure that it's going to account for each different criteria event, and it's really going to align with your team's desire to include all of the relevant and appropriate subject information in your narrative. So when you don't have the use of technology and you're developing your template manually, maybe you have a lack of visibility against the data. What you want to see in your template isn't ultimately how the data is captured. Whereas when you are using technology and you are programming your narrative template, you actually have visibility to the entire data set as you're building out your template. So you're identifying areas for improvement or rework as you're working through your template and producing a higher quality template ultimately. The next scenario is an expedited timeline. We've all been faced with this. How are we going to get this many narratives done in this amount of time? So without technology, you might find you're going through many process steps. The entire process is very convoluted and it's more difficult to get to that timeline with confidence. When you're working with technology, you're following a more streamlined workflow and you're able to get and meet that timeline with confidence. The last service scenario is the burden on the client review team. So a lot of times the reviewers that are assigned to review the narratives are the same reviewers reviewing the CSR at the same time. So they have a lot on their plate. When we're working without technology and we're fully manually writing narratives, sometimes we have to deliver large batches at once, and this can really inundate that review team. When we're working with technology, again, because of the efficiencies we gain in the process, we're able to deliver narratives iteratively, smaller batches, a little bit easier to digest by that review team. So I want to show you what a complicated process looks like when you're working with a vendor and also your internal groups. And even if you are utilizing technology in your process, it can still be very complicated. So in this graphic, I'm showing moments of time and cost, including resource utilization that impacts several process steps. So for example, let's say that you've resourced your stats programming team to program your narrative template. They do that, we go through the finalization steps, it's ready to go for your vendor to work with, but wait, we have to put the project on hold because we don't have our final TLFs or patient profiles for that vendor to work with to get started. Okay, let's say we receive those, we're ready to go. That vendor's starting to draft and all of a sudden the review team's showing some areas in the template that need to be reworked. Back to that internal stats group, that template goes. Let's put the project on hold yet again. So all of these initial startup kickoff activities in the process are put on holds, and there's maybe the potential for redo loops to keep happening. Maybe you are then ready to go, you're writing your narratives, and the team you're working with wants to see narratives in 2 different drafts before you can get to final. Allow me now to present you a more streamlined process when you're working with technology. So one of the key elements for success here is you want to utilize a vendor and technology that can support your narrative drafting from start to finish. So this vendor should be the one-stop shop. They can produce this program template and then they can write the full narratives as well, complete them through to finalization. So working with a vendor and your internal groups doesn't have to be complicated. That data is locked and provided to that vendor, and they would program the narrative template. If there is any need to go back and re-edit the template based on sample feedback, re-one is quick. You know, you're not sitting on your internal programming group to redo the template, and the workflow is continuing. Once that template is finalized and ready to go for full drafting, the writing team has provided that template as the outputs to complete the drafting efforts, and that team is able to work with the SDTM and Adams data directly. So it's another key piece. Because the team is using that data set directly in programming the templates, they can also likely write to it as well. Another key component here is applying template standardization, which is so important, and I'll touch on in a little bit as well, is you want to apply a standard template to your submissions. Every narrative is going to want to be written to that same template, and it's edited on a study-specific basis. And the last element for success is really strategic planning on everyone's part. So if you're working with that vendor, it's being proactive. It's really a combination of strategic planning on everyone's part so that the process in the beginning is kicked off and streamlined, and the production from there forward is made much more efficient. So just to recap, how can technology support the writing process? Just to speak more generally, you know, Synchrogenix, like many other companies, are really expanding our technology suite to support medical writing. Technology is the future, and there are so many benefits that can come out of utilizing tech to our advantage. The big benefits include decreases in production time. You know, the need for a medical writer to write on top of a program template or anything that uses technology is much lessened. And as a result of this, internal efficiency gains, that vendor is likely able to offer a reduced cost for that work as well. And just the process overall, resource utilization, when we're thinking about resource in terms of costs, is much lessened. So technology fosters this environment of increased quality, consistency, and standardization. Of course, we always want to make better quality documents. We want to produce the best quality we can for submissions, especially drug submissions. Consistency is also very, very key to success here. As Beth mentioned, you know, you could be writing hundreds or even thousands of narratives for a study. You want them all to be consistent, especially same event types or similar event types. And then also standardization. If you're able to program through the use of technology, that standard narrative template, that template can be used for each study. Maybe it's tweaked on a study specific basis, but overall your submission portfolio is very consistent. So when you are working with technology or software, you would need to use that SDTM or Adams data, that clinical data, but you also want to pull in any of the other supplemental data that you're using to support narrative drafting. As Beth mentioned, COMs, MedWatch forms, any other supplemental source data that is pulled into the narrative to create a complete story. I want to also hone in that technology makes the process most efficient when you're working with a large volume of patients that meet criteria. And you're also working in expedited timelines. So how many times have you received an email from the FDA that says, you know, we want 1,000 narratives by tomorrow that highlight this event type? If you already have your programming for your template set up, you would simply need to press run, and you would save a tremendous amount of manual writing time. And you would be able to meet that timeline, that request, with ease and confidence. All right, so now just to speak to the standardization of templates. As Beth mentioned, templates have evolved to present patient data in a more streamlined way. This is really going to favor using tables for data as opposed to running text, which actually makes the narrative a lot more reader friendly. And of course, you want that template to align with your style guide and be consistent from study to study, as I mentioned. This makes for a cleaner submission portfolio. It makes running the programming very easy. Oftentimes, you don't need to make any tweaks at all if your data is laid out the same from study to study. And you can also utilize software that can proactively redact and anonymize data. So this is a great thing to think about when you are writing your CSR. Is there some sort of software out there that could create a copy of the CSR with anonymized and redacted data, which would reduce the expenditure and the process downstream of doing this? So just to give you some examples of templates. So I've created snapshots of the front end of a template, and you'll see it's very tabular. So all of the data points you see here, yellow highlighted, are those that you can actually pull in from the clinical data. So this is going to produce sort of the backbone, the bulk of the template information for the writer and the quality control reviewer to then go in and add upon. So looking at the back end of a template, that's where you're going to see more of the running text to add in the description around your criteria event. So in these areas, oftentimes it's a little bit more tricky to just drag and drop in data, right? You don't want to drag and drop in every adverse event. You want to only pull in those adverse events that meet writing criteria. So because of this, you might need to use a little bit more of logic and advanced programming beyond just this drag and drop to really create that shell and that backbone with the qualifying AE details, which then serves as a base for the writer to go in and add any additional supplemental data. You'll see the red text here are annotations, and that's actually really good. That's going to guide your writers, and it's going to guide your reviewers as well, you know, how to add in that supplemental information and how to do it aligned with your style guide and your overall desired presentation. So even depending on the criteria and the need to pull in supplemental information, you could pretty much fully program a narrative template where there would be no need to go in and make any manual edits at all. And you wouldn't need to necessarily go in and verify all of the data points in each individual narrative, as long as you're ensuring that your mapping and your programming is accurate during the template development stage. So this is just a really great, evolving field of utilizing technology for narratives. I've seen the success of working with this programmed base and how much time it truly saves versus the old school way of writing manual. So just to wrap up our presentation, what does the future of patient safety narrative production look like? You know, we want to make it more streamlined, we want to make it more efficient, and we do this through the use of technology-enabled authoring. So we're working with technology on our side to help us complete the full drafting efforts. So technology performs the bulk of that legwork for the writing team, a bulk of that drag and drop data work. But I want to make a note that it's not completely eliminating the need for well-educated, experienced medical writers. Computers aren't going to take our place when it's our job to discern all of the relevant details around the event and, really piece together that cohesive, thorough, detailed story in the narrative.
And the use of technology to assist in programming the narratives and the efficiencies that are subsequently produced lead to companies being able to respond to a regulatory authority's request for narratives with ease. Turnaround times are much faster because of the time saved, and the quality of the narratives produced is better, as there's less room for error with a more focused team and a more focused output and a more streamlined process.
And again, the future is really pointing to focusing on that proactive data anonymization and redaction. If you want to even build out your template with an eye to, okay, what fields will I need to anonymize or redact downstream? How can I eliminate those fields, lessen those fields as I'm developing my template, ahead of time to avoid the breadth of that rework downstream. So really technology is pointing to being able to proactively do that when you're writing your narratives for your first time.
And in conclusion, narratives are no longer the forgotten piece of a regulatory submission, but rather the most successful and the most efficient part as you prepare and take a proactive approach using template standardization from the start, improving efficiencies and reducing cost as we head into the future. So thank you for your time today. We'd now be happy to answer any questions you may have. You can pop them into the chat. I see there is a question in the chat now. The programmed narrative profiles are often long. Example, oncology studies. How easy is it for regulators, for example, to review such long narratives? In my opinion, I feel like they're actually easier for regulators to review, because while the page count may sometimes be longer, it's very organized as far as the tabular format, like Gabriella showed, where the regulators, the reviewers can go straight to whatever information they're interested in looking at. And the actual text portion of the narrative is shorter and more concise and easier to read and get through.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, you don't want to cut valuable information out of your narrative. Just thinking about how long it could be. The common narrative length would be 2, maybe 3 pages, but we've definitely seen narratives that can be upwards of 15 pages, maybe even more. So having all of your relevant and important data to include in the tabular format, as opposed to running text, you can actually review it a lot quicker. So think about listing out all your con meds in a tabular format, all your medical history. You can very quickly move from term to term, see the dates started and stopped, and a lot easier than reading, paragraph after paragraph. Imagine a narrative of 15 pages with just paragraphs. All right, I see another question that came in. Have you had occasions where regulators have rejected narratives? So in the sponsors that we've worked with in the past, we've actually not seen a case where regulators reject narratives based on the layout and the template followed, being it that more tabular with a little bit of running text template. So we have not seen an instance of that in our work with our clients thus far.
There's a question, are the narratives you described today more of the hybrid type with some descriptive text, or are these fully programmed? So as far as hybrid, I think you might mean like patient profiles with some added text. And we're able to program all of that, including the patient profiles and the text. And really the only things we can't program are adding information from the CIOMS forms. So most of our program narratives are somewhere between 75 and 100% programmed, where the manual portions that we add are just extra information that was available in CIOMS or MedWatch forms.
Yeah, and to go off of Beth, this really depends on the complexity you're working with as well, the complexity of the template, and also the criteria that subject meets. So for example, if that subject had one adverse event leading to discontinuation, and no safety data needed to be pulled in for that subject, we could very easily, program that narrative 100%. So no manual edits were needed. And I see another question that came in around the submissions, the number of submissions that we've made using the programmed format for narratives. So our internal process has been to implement technology into the process of drafting narratives, which we offer as, a service offering. So we've supported very many clients in the past year to support narrative submissions, and just focusing on program narratives alone, we've generated over 10,000 narratives. And this leads to the next question, which is, did you develop the technology for your program narratives? Was it in-house or do you use another software? So we have a proprietary software that we've developed in-house that supports this process. It is a fully 21 CFR Part 11 compliant software. It's gone through, rigorous testing, and we've used it to support our service offering for narratives. And what we essentially do is we take that clinical database, that STTM, that ADAMS data, and we map that into your narrative template, and we generate that template out of our system for our writers and our quality control reviewers to work with. Now, some narratives are going to be fully programmed, where there is no need for a writer or QCer to go in and manually make edits. But for SAE narratives, for example, then we would bring in our experienced medical writing team to go and complete that drafting and submit the narrative for draft review and then finalization. So we have developed a software internally. I know that we would be happy to give a live, demonstration to whomever may be interested. As a result of this presentation, certainly connect with us, and we'd love to give you a look at that software. See, another question came in regarding if you don't have access to STTM data, have you programmed narratives using patient profiles or listings? So we think of the programming process that we're doing with our templates is actually the step right before producing patient profiles or listings. So that's something that your stats team would be doing. They're taking that STTM and ADAMS data and they're creating patient profiles and listings. So we want to kind of peel back a layer before, and we want the opportunity to be able to do that for our clients, for sponsors, because we wouldn't want to reproduce the effort, right? We wouldn't need to use listings or patient profiles for writing. What we want to do is actually have access to that clinical data, your SAS data files, and be able to program the template on our end using that data source.
There's also a couple questions in the chat. One question is, would you share your experience regarding quantitative narrative criteria, such as elevated LFTs? The example template shown in the slides makes it appear that the narratives for AEs of special interest focus solely on the MEDRA term. So the software can filter and flag items such as laboratory results that were flagged as high or low. So that's also an option. It doesn't have to be a situation where we're just using AEs of special interest. So if there are certain laboratory results that are flagged of interest that require a narrative, then we can also use that in our programming.
Yeah, absolutely. That comes with kind of the sophisticated higher level coding and logic that we apply to our programming to capture that criteria. So in the current software we use, we're very much not limited at all by what criteria we can capture. For the sake of this presentation, we did show a very, streamlined, straightforward AEs as meeting criteria, but we have worked with many sponsors in the past where their criteria is an elevated lab result. So we can alter our programming to support that. And in addition, for those specific narratives that meet that lab criteria, populate certain sections of the template that support that event type. So let's say you wanted an LFT lab table in those AESIs, but you didn't want to see that same lab table in your narratives with SAEs. We can actually achieve that programmatically, where we can turn on and off that template section or that lab table depending on the criteria that that subject meets. So I see another question as well. So what are the advantages of redacting or anonymizing your CSRs as you're authoring? Is this also a proprietary technology? So this question hits on a synergy that we're experiencing right now in the development of our text suite. So this is overlapping with our CSR production, our redaction and anonymization, and also our narratives. So our current software capabilities, as we are expanding them, can really hone in on all of these different processes, occurring at once in a program manner. So again, we see the opportunity to be able to redact in a CSR, redact and anonymize the CSR proactively as you're working on it, as extremely valuable. So it could be, as Synchrogenix supports the work for the CSR and the narratives, we create those two versions for you. And then we also create two copies with that CSR redacted and those narratives redacted or anonymized as well. So we understand the value of these synergies and are definitely pursuing them as we continue to build out our tech software.
So I see a question here, will the COMs or safety data auto-generated in the narratives, and do the writers modify the context of the data to make a story out of it? Or is the safety database used as a separate source? So generally, we use the clinical database to program the narratives, and then the medical writer will go in and manually add relevant information from the COMs or other forms such as MedWatch or case report form or any other information that was not in the clinical database. The medical writer can add in manually to kind of add to that story and provide any additional information that can't be programmed if it's not in the clinical database.
Yeah, and we do have opportunities to kind of drag and drop like a mass population of that COMS form information. But we find that that's really where the writer and the QCer shines to create the complete story. So while we do program the backbone of that AE/SAE, for example, the writer would then weave in the appropriate COMS information to complete drafting there. And another similar question was asked, if dealing with a live database not locked for an ongoing study, if there's missing data, incorrect units, how is that all dealt with? Does it have to be caught manually or caught in the programming? So much of this we can capture in the programming. So for example, we were working with a client recently where it was not yet cleaned up data, but they wanted to get out narratives due to an FDA request. So many fields in the data were blank. And this was due to that information not being reported, right? So we programmed the template and we noticed all of these blanks. And we didn't want our writers to then have to go into this template and populate all of those blank tables. And what we were able to do is actually program that field in the template. So anytime that field's populated blank, instead of being blank, we inserted, the phrase not reported to populate in those instances. Or when we were working in tables, we defined it as NR, and then we created a footnote. So there are many different ways in our programming that we can change the way that the data is captured and make it more reader friendly and also align with the template presentation and your style guide. So for example, for the fields, no action was taken as a result of the event. No action was taken with study drug, right? And the data is captured as dose not changed in all caps. And if we couldn't achieve this programmatically, our writers would have to go in and revise those instances of dose not changed to read no action was taken with study drug as a result of the event. This is actually something we can do in our programming to bring the template really to that next level and to ensure that data is not only captured correctly, but it is presented in the way that we want to present it in that template.
So there's a question here. How long does it typically take to develop the programmed narrative template? So generally, as far as business days, it would take about 2 weeks to program the narrative template. But then we're saving a lot of time on the back end as far as writing and QC. Typically, we're able to cut the writing and QC time by 2/3 or 3/4, depending on the criteria or the complexity. So then a narrative that would normally take 4 hours to write would only take approximately 1. And so you save a lot of time on that end as far as the programming.
Yeah, I agree that upfront programming time is very minuscule compared to the savings in time you see when those templates are all generated. We like to think of it as a separate process entirely, and we like to think of it as the important first steps to ensure alignment from both ends. So as we're building out that program template, we will produce samples as well for our sponsors to review. They can come back with any template edits that they like for us to implement, and we'll continue to refine our programming and our template until we get it right from the start. This really, we see it's helped with receiving global comments on draft reviews when we do actually start writing all the narratives. And it really is able to focus that review team a little bit more on what they're supposed to be reviewing in the narrative. So they've already seen the samples. They're able to see which fields that we've programmed versus the fields we've manually edited. And they're able to really focus their review going forward on those fields that maybe are the ones we manually edited, are the ones that are populated with COMS text as opposed to the clinical data and the programming.
And if there is a huge time crunch, we can program the template using draft data. So then by the time the database lock occurs, you can get right to the writing. And hopefully at that point, there'd be minimal updates to the data.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we have a question. Do you have plans to expand your technology to the CSR main body or other documents? We would love to continue this conversation further after this presentation, because yes, we do have technology capabilities to support CSR writing as well. We're adapting many of these similar features within the software that we've built out for narrative production into a similar software that does the same thing for CSRs, and pulls from your SAP, your protocol, and is able to populate the CSR with as many fields programmed as possible, then to be supported by one of our medical writers. So I see another one as well. What about errors in the data being imported? So we don't see any errors in the data actually being imported, unless it's in a different file format that we wouldn't be able to import. So we actually are able to just take SAS files and import them into our software. And we do take, your comprehensive ADAMS or STTM data. So we would request kind of the entire data set to work with, unless we're able to identify only the data fields that we would need to work with based on the template, and would request those. So a little bit longer one, we're trying to read it. Related to the previous question, can the writer or others, like the study physician, flag data of interest during programming on an individual narrative basis to have these included in the program text? For example, preceding or overlapping events may be relevant to the event of interest. Traditionally, these have been selected manually to include in the story. So my immediate response to that is yes, and we can achieve this by looking at the data set comprehensively, and maybe we want to create some sort of like date relation. So we want to think about, okay, our SAE occurs in March, let's say. So we want to pull in events that could have occurred 30 to 69 30, 60, 90 days maybe before that SAE, right? So we would have those programmed to pull in as potentially relevant AEs related to that SAE. The challenge we face is kind of discerning that word relevant, right? It's used in medical history, it's used in ConMeds, and it's also used for events that get pulled in. So if we can somehow identify what the team of reviewers with the sponsor is determining as relevant in the data. So maybe you're saying, you know, relevant medical history is medical history with the indication of X or a category of X. We can definitely make those programming leaps to determine what's relevant and really modify the template that way. So it depends on how the data is captured, but we can definitely do it. And it's something that we do proactively think about when we are programming templates. You know, let's try to pull in all of the details that we can surrounding the event to really limit what needs to be pulled in manually.
And kind of related to that, if it's an event that may have a certain laboratory result of interest, you could set up the programming to say that for this type of event, pull in this laboratory result, depending on what is relevant to certain events.
Mm-hmm. And we'll just answer one more question. So what if there's errors in the data that's being imported? So we do see this sometimes commonly where there's a typo, right, that's captured in the data, something spelled completely wrong. Maybe a number has, you know, an extra digit or whatnot. It's clearly an incorrect data point that's captured. We would identify those through manual means. So we would flag it in our drafting efforts, because really this is where we use our writing team and our QCers to kind of pick up on, you know, maybe what's not correct that we wouldn't be able to tell just pulling in the data. So we have trained our team to really look out for those instances, you know, fix spelling errors, or at least note that they have corrected it. And a lot of times when we do make these identify and when we do flag these, they are actually taken internally. You know, the sponsor is going to make that resolution, get that cleaned up in the data set, so that it ultimately doesn't make it to the CSR.
Great. I think we answered all the questions in the Q&A.
But just to show our contact information, we'd be happy to answer any questions after this presentation we weren't able to get to. And please feel free to reach out to our account management team. Again, if you'd like to see a demo of the software, we'd be happy to give it to you. And we really thank you for your time today. And we hope that you're a little bit more educated about narratives and the narrative process moving forward, and you're inspired by the use of technology.